In our presentation for the Behavior Change Project, we'll be discussing the functional relation of goal setting and feedback on periodic running distance. In collaboration of this study are listed as follows: Catherine Everest, Caitlin Legier, Novia Ramos, Priscilla Chapa, Raymond Shelley, Shaylin Berger. The study served as a replication project for the Ball State University as a group project for class SPCE 611. And with us today is Professor Dr. Honer. And now we'll be moving on to our overview. For our overview, we're going to discuss research background. We'll also be discussing the purpose of the project, the methods that were utilized within our study, and for our replication. We'll also be discussing the results that each participant got and what contributed to those results. We'll also be discussing the conclusion and whether our replication was effective. And we'll also be discussing the limitations that played into our replication. And now we'll be moving on to our research background.
So finding methods of objective physical improvement or like performance enhancement is really just kind of a timeless, age-old pursuit. And one particular avenue of this is to utilize the principles of behavior to kind of find methods of how to increase both professional athletes and individuals at home. And one of those ways is through positive reinforcement. And so a lot of the narrative of this research focuses primarily on goal achievement and feedback. Now, first we have Ropes and Ward found that when a female soccer team posted their progress, set their own goals, and received oral feedback, it showed some positive effects for their practices. Interestingly, though, this particular study didn't really show a lot of generalizability for the scrimmages or league competitions, just the practices. In 2006, Melu, Henton, and O'Brien found that goal setting was good to help improve task-specific abilities during college rugby games. By task-specific, I mean objective behaviors like catching a ball, making a tackle, scoring points, things like that. Then Normand in 2008 found that feedback and goal setting combined with self-monitoring increased general physical activity in the form of steps taken per day. And further meta-analysis by Reese, Pitzinger, and Yang in 2012 found that goal setting actually increased both confidence levels and coping abilities for athletes that had sustained sports-related injuries. It didn't affect anything like healing time or pain management, things like that, but it did assist with their just kind of mental attitude towards different qualitative measures. And Priscilla, you're going to be talking about the purpose of the study.
Okay. So the Center for Disease Control and Prevention stated that engaging in consistent physical activity had many health benefits such as weight control, muscle strength, cardiovascular health, and mental health. Also, previous research has shown that goal setting can enhance a person's physical performance along with providing feedback to increase those goals and their effectiveness. And the article that we chose to replicate, which is Wack, Crosland, and Miltenberger, examined the effects of these variables on the running distance. So in whole, the purpose of our study was to replicate the Wack, Crosland, and Miltenberger 2014 experiment and compare their results and see if it was effective. And now we'll be moving on to the participants.
Due to the nature of the course, and unlike the study that we replicated, our researchers also served as participants in the study. Participants included Shaylin Berger, Priscilla Chapa, Catherine Everest, Caitlin Legier, Novia Ramos, and Raymond Shelley. How we decided what researcher was assigned to which participant was by an alphabetical order list by last name. Once we put those in order, we used the first person on the list to be the researcher for the second person for the third person, and so on. You can see that to the graphic at the right, which way that diagram went. Participants were also given a physical activity readiness questionnaire This was just a few questions to determine whether they were healthy, whether they could be running, whether they were able to participate in this study, and if it could potentially be effective for them. For setting and materials, the setting took place outdoors and all over the state, since we had group members from all of these different states listed here. We chose not to do a specific track just because not all of us had access to a track. So the only stipulation was outdoor running. We used a GPS system on a device through an application. So whatever device you ran with, be it your phone or an iPad, something else, it needs to be able to be GPS capable and be able to download the application. This required a stable internet connection, whether it was through that device or through your home computer, to log your data. Each researcher and participant had access to a Google Sheets log. So after each running episode, the participant would log their running data from the app into the Google Sheets log, where they could then send it to the researcher. The researcher would compare the Google Sheets log to the Endomondo application and a screenshot of the running session that the participant sent to them. We also use a video conferencing platform to meet with our researchers once per session, just to set our future goal, discuss our data, provide feedback, and move forward with the study. For the behavior and definition, a running episode consisted of a continuous run at a speed faster than a brisk walk, which was 1 mile per 15 minutes. We went ahead and took this definition straight from the study that we are replicating so that we could make it as similar as possible. I have a couple of examples and non-examples listed for you here. So running at a continuous rate of 16 minutes per mile would not be considered a continuous running episode for this study. The episodes were recorded daily, so every day we ran, we took a screenshot of what we ran, sent it to our researcher, and then logged our data into the Google Sheets. We then took those data and broke them into sessions. A session consisted of 2 consecutive days. So each running day had a certain mileage. We added those 2 days together to get 1 total mileage for a session. This is unlike the study that we replicated in that their sessions were consisted of an entire week. We were a little constrained on time, so we had to break that down to just 2 days for a session.
To assess the effects of goal setting and performance feedback, we used a multiple baseline design across subjects with an embedded changing criteria design for intervention 2. All participants started baseline on the same day. We'll later discuss the manner in which participants were introduced to the treatment phase, but pretty much they just needed to show stability in their baseline data and to meet the criterion level once in treatment. There was only 1 participant that was not introduced to the intervention due to the high variability. We'll move on to baseline now. So prior to the baseline condition, the participant and researcher met to review all the technicalities of the Endomondo application. Once baseline began, participants used the Endomondo app to track their runs and log their mileage per session on a Google Sheet. Participants did not set short-term or long-term goals, and the researcher also did not provide any feedback during this phase. As below, you can see an example of the log used to track mileage. So the treatment requirements included that the participant showed stability in baseline data with no fewer than 5 data points. The second requirement was that once in intervention, implementation for subsequent participants began once the preceding participant reached criterion. So that was meeting their short-term goal with no fewer than 5 data points as well. During the treatment phase, participant and researcher met for an initial meeting to set their short-term goal for the first week and the long-term goal that the participant hoped to run at the conclusion of the study. Participants were to complete at least 1 run during the session at or above the set criterion level. If the short-term goal was met, the participant was able to increase their goal for the next session, and To decrease injury, each participant could not increase their session goal by more than 1/4 mile per session. If a participant did not meet their short-term goal, they were given the choice to either stay at the same level or for the next session or reduce their goal. And the meetings were held video conference application after each session was completed. To assess IOA data, we used total count IOA, and there was 2 independent observers, the participant and the researcher. Both recorded the date and the distance ran per episode. So the participant, during baseline, the participant uploaded their mileage on the Google Sheets because they didn't have any contact with the researcher. Once intervention began, the participants still logged their mileage, and the researcher evaluated the data and compared it against the data on the Endomondo sites. And IOA agreement was 100% across all participants. So to assess treatment fidelity, we came up with a 7-item list that was self-reported. And this was to make sure that all researchers were following the same procedures. The initial meeting had a different checklist because the session was a little bit differently. But for the first initial session, treatment fidelity was 100%. And for the following sessions, we achieved 94% fidelity across all researchers.
So before we discuss each person's individual results, we wanted to present our multiple baseline graph with that embedded changing criterion design. On the y-axis, you'll see running distance in miles. So that's the total miles run over one session. You would typically see a consistent scale on the y-axis, but due to large range in running distances per session, which was like from 0 to 21 miles, each of the graphs are scaled individually. Across the x-axis is the session. Again, it's 2 days that equal one session. So for myself, I was the first one to be introduced into baseline, one because my baseline data was stable, but also because my name came first in alphabetical order. So I was the first one in. At the beginning of intervention, my motivation was extremely high. One, I really wanted to meet my long-term goal, my short-term goals, but also the group contingency of needing to get other people into intervention based on our very short time frame. By session 9, my motivation was still fairly high, but other things came into play with my kid and scheduling and those sessions being so short, and you miss one night or you have something scheduled that night and that day is shot. So I turned to intervention 2 thinking that it would be more helpful and easier, but due to the short time frames of our sessions, it ended up being pretty much the same as intervention 1. I did increase my average running distance from 0 in baseline to 0.67 per session over the entire intervention.
So my graph is next. You can see that I have the same baseline data as Catherine, but like she said, her name was first, mine came second, so I went into intervention second. When I went into intervention, I knew that I needed to set my goal a bit lower. I despise running and I am not a good runner. So I knew that in order to be able to reach my short-term goal, I needed to set it a little bit lower towards my own capabilities. You can see that I started with an upward trend, and then my last 2 sessions took a huge nosedive. I ended up getting bronchitis towards the end of that, and I was not able to run for the last 4 days, which would have been the 2 sessions. At the bottom here, you can see my baseline average and range were obviously 0 since I did not run at all during baseline. Then my intervention 1 average was 0.27, and my intervention 1 range was 0 to 0.8, which was my longest and furthest running episode or session. Personally, this study was not as reinforcing for me. I think as it was some of my group mates, a lot of them I know found the goal setting to be very reinforcing, or if not the goal setting, then the feedback from the researcher to be reinforcing. I think that if it were more of a tangible reinforcer, or even maybe a researcher of higher authority, it would have been a little bit different. Catherine was my researcher, and I was very cool telling Catherine, hey, I did not end up getting to run today. Didn't hurt me too badly. So I think some of those stipulations may affect how some of us progress throughout the study.
So I went into intervention next. As you can see, I also had a baseline of 0. I had just come off of a small injury, so it was easy for me not to run during baseline. Once my intervention started being a runner, I was able to set my short-term goals higher. I am a very competitive person, so I enjoyed being able to set the goals and reach those goals and meet them. However, I did have a family emergency that came into play, so I was unable to run on weekends. So I was not able to meet my goals during the weekends. During the week, I was able to meet them, and overall, just enjoyed the study. I'm a runner, so I had a lot of fun. So at the start and baseline, I had 0, and I was able to turn my average into 3.56 miles. My range went from 0 to 7.34 miles.
I was the 4th person to go into baseline, or into intervention. My baseline average was 0.26, and my baseline range was 0 to 1.16. For my baseline, I did start off running because I just wanted my body to be prepared when going into intervention so as not to overexhaust myself when I did get there. Once I was in intervention, though, you can see that my first 3 sessions had an upward trend, and I was meeting my goals, and I was very motivated to meet them because I'm competitive against myself. And then I ended up catching a virus, which is where you'll see my downward trend, and I wasn't able to recover in time to bring my trend back up. But my intervention range average did increase to 0.83, and my range increased as well from 0 to 1.70. And I personally enjoyed this replication and the study and the feedback that was given to me. It did motivate me, and I think a big factor that played was I'm motivated to also beat myself, so that helped as well. It's just when I got sick, those are just things I couldn't control. But overall, I enjoyed the study.
All right. So my baseline average was 2.97 with a range of 0 miles to 6.77. And earlier we discussed the requirements to introduce treatment, which were to have steady state during baseline. With the variability shown in my baseline, I don't think we were quite ready to introduce the treatment. We probably could have gone a few more sessions of baseline until I showed some stability. However, once in intervention, I was able to complete my short-term goals. Overall, as you can see, the intervention average was 3.14, so it was a slight increase, but not significant enough. And although there was variability, like I said, that I was achieving my short-term goals. I think that if I would have probably continued with the intervention, I'm pretty sure I could have increased my running distance, and you could have shown some effects of the treatment.
So earlier we were talking about how some of our participants were not running during baseline. Since I was running, I knew that it was not likely that I would be able to reach intervention early on. But I do consider myself a runner, and so I did feel compelled to produce steady data at first so that I could fit into the intervention as soon as possible because I was anxious to try it out. However, I decided to resist that urge and run the way I normally run, which unfortunately is quite variable. There were some additional extraneous variables that occurred during my baseline that prevented me from entering intervention. For example, during session 6, you'll see that it was a quite high cumulative distance, over 20 miles was run in those 48 hours. That was particularly due to the fact that that fell on my birthday, and I typically run, I ran 13.5 miles, kind of like a half marathon, just that's something I do traditionally on that date. And a few days after that, I sustained a shoulder injury, which was exacerbated by running, so I wasn't able really to continue, so that's why you see that downslope. But regardless, due to that, I just typically don't have a very stable running history. So I think the baseline is actually quite representative of my running habits. As you see, the average is 7.94 miles, but the range goes from anywhere from, a wide range from 0 to 21.28 cumulative, with the highest running episode being 13.5 miles.
The following table is, you'll see our participants' session goals. So they're the goal that they set with their researcher and the goal achievement in miles during intervention 1 and 2. Because this is about intervention, there's no baseline data included in here. And next to the ×1, you may see an asterisk, and that indicates that the goal was achieved for that session. So for myself, I met 50% of my goals. Caitlin met 43%. Nolvia met 100% of her goals. Priscilla met 60% of her goals, and Shay met 66%. Ray is obviously not depicted here because he did not enter intervention. As a whole, we achieved 60% of all of our short-term goals. The top table here, table 2, is our long-term goals that you can see that we set for ourselves, and nobody met them, unfortunately. Table 3 is the changes and averages of each participant from baseline to the end of the intervention. So you can see everybody but Priscilla, except for Noli in this case, increased their averages from baseline to the end of the intervention. At the end of the intervention, we administered a social validity questionnaire. This was run on a 5-point Likert scale. We had 4 questions that were brought up in this scenario. So in this one, so the first question was, I enjoyed participating in this study. The average score was a 4, which meant we all agreed that we enjoyed participating. 3.3, that means that we had a little bit of discrepancy, whether we were neutral or agreed that we were happy with the results we achieved. We also, kind of similar area there, 3.67, whether the goal setting procedure is actually motivating or not. And same thing with if we plan to continue running after the intervention finished.
So overall, the study was effective for the majority of the participants. We were able to set our own goals, so we felt comfortable and not overwhelmed with the miles that we were going to run. The Endomondo app was used to ensure fidelity for the screenshots that were taken of the finished run and was sent to the researcher, where the participant would receive feedback and would set the next session's goals. In the end, 80% of the participants were able to increase their distance run. Our results show similarity to the original study. In our replication, we had participants receive a completion of 43%. 2 participants had 50%, 1 had 66%, and we had 1 with 100%, with only 1 of our participants entering into intervention 2. Whereas in the original study, they had 1 participant with 80%, 1 with 82%, and 2 with 100%. They did have 3 participants enter into intervention 2, however. At the end of the study, each of the participants answered the social validity questionnaire. The results were positive, however, they were not ideal. This could be due to the shortened version of the sessions that we had, and you know, life happens. Some of us got sick, some of us had family emergencies. Things pop up, things happen, which can make it stressful if you're trying to compete with yourself. But in the end, the study was able to be replicated.
So obviously, the study did have a lot of limitations. Some of them are artifacts of the original study that was replicated. Some of them are of our own design. Some were unavoidable, but some were just kind of from the nature of the study. One of the largest limitations that we experienced was just the inherent effect of the dual role that we shared as both researchers and participants. This actually kind of created a lot of issues, and we really struggled to structure the design to mitigate the extraneous variables that came from that. The fact that each participant was able to see at least one other participant's running data did cause a lot of extra variables in terms of something to the like of a social desirability effect, where being able to see someone else's made us want to either maybe feel compelled to meet or exceed that person's performance. And one of the ways we mitigated against that was the structure you saw earlier, where we only allowed, it was kind of an honor roll system technically, but we tried to get only one person's data as opposed to everyone being able to see everyone else's. Another issue is that because we were also researchers, we were all fully aware of the study's hypothesis. Now, the original study had students who were interested in extending their running distances. So they, I'm sure, were quite aware of what the study's hypothesis was. However, the original study did not really explain how aware the students were of what the specific independent variables were, as opposed to us, who we were entirely aware. So that had some issues. It kind of likened to a bit of a demand characteristic, in the sense that we felt an urge to actually produce data that would allow us to replicate the study. And furthermore, that also meant that the independent variables were anticipated, specifically the feedback portion. We all kind of discussed it and decided that the feedback, while we all agree that it was genuine positive feedback from our peers, it was also anticipated, and therefore probably didn't have the same salience, wasn't as strong of a reinforcer as it could have been had it been more impromptu. And so that became somewhat of an issue. I think the largest variable that really affected us was the constrained time limits. This created a couple of problems. One, it gave us a lot of motivation to produce data. For some of us, that really came into play during, like for myself, during baseline. While the pattern I'm running was representative, I ran more frequently, especially due to the session length. On the other side, the idea that because the time limit was so constrained, that some of us felt like we would not get into intervention or spend that long in intervention, and therefore the overall effects wouldn't really be that significant. And so that could have caused us just to have lower expectations about the study as a whole. And due to this, the time limit, we decided to reduce the session length, as stated before, from a whole week into 2 days. This had a lot of repercussions that we didn't really anticipate when we made that decision. One was that it made just setting goals kind of difficult. In fact, maintaining the goals became increasingly difficult throughout the study. Another problem with this is that since the requirement was that we produce data within the session for at least 1 day, this effectively made it so that we had to run every other day, which can cause a lot of fatigue effects. And this also created a strange data issue, in that if we went more than 1 day without running, we would report a 0 for that session. And whereas the original study had a week-long session, we had much more of a risk of hitting a lot of zeros, which would destabilize the data that we were producing. Furthermore, with the goal increasing limits, since the sessions were so short, we decided to reduce it from half a mile to a quarter mile in our study. But a lot of people felt that that was kind of created an upper boundary limit that, you know, once we started running, we wanted to increase our goals higher, but we're unable to do so. I believe it was Caitlin that mentioned that, or actually no one was able to meet the long-term goals. So had that been increased, that might not have been a factor. And of course, naturally, when you are doing something involving physical performance, practice effects always come into play, especially those of us who have experience running but may not have been running recently. A lot of practice effects could have come into effect there. From the original study, they brought up the idea of negative reinforcement as a potential extraneous variable, in the sense that setting a goal and having that goal hanging over your head could create an aversive environment by which running would be a figurative escape from that environment. So that would be an extra variable to consider. And upon research, we found out that GPS reliability actually could play a role in some of the variability we were experiencing. As it turns out, a GPS device works much more efficiently if you're running in straight lines, basically, like on a trail or along a long street, versus making multiple direction changes, either by just taking turns or by being on a track. So the more turns you make, the more GPS actually degrades. So that was something that came into play. And something that we discovered late, actually, somewhat recently when we were compiling the data, is that having those short session lengths, another way that really shot us in the foot was that these boundaries that we set for sessions, which are essentially arbitrary, had a real marked effect on the overall data that we were able to produce. And to show on the bottom, we have Novia's baseline information. I just chose hers at random. The black circle, that's her original baseline data. And the second path, the white triangles, that is an adjusted baseline. It's the same exact data, but the difference is that that data would be if we started baseline collection on October 7th as opposed to October 6th. So just one day apart, and you see the data is quite different. And again, the original study, the longer the session lengths are, the less of a factor that would be. And we see too, the averages are not, you know, majorly different, but they are different enough to where that bears consideration. So as a whole, we decided that going forward, if we were to research this again, especially if we were to attempt a replication again, there's going to be a lot of changes they would have to make to control for some of these variables. You know, first and foremost would be the environment that we were running in. It would be ideal if each individual had access to a standardized track, for example, a standard 400-meter track, and that we would perform all of our running episodes on said track. That way we could mitigate certain environmental variables like elevation changes, the GPS precision. Therefore, even if the accuracy wasn't great, at least the reliability of the device would produce consistent readings. And would also eliminate other environmental distractions like traffic or just, you know, which route you want to take. We also would extend the session lengths and, you know, to mitigate all the effects that I discussed earlier, like the arbitrary boundaries and things like that. And, you know, the other issue with the dual role conflict, we discussed that the only real way to mitigate those effects would be if we had an assigned individual that would act as the person compiling all of the data. You know, just as it was, having that dual role created a kind of a conflict that was just kind of unavoidable. But over and all, I think that our study did show promising confirmation about what the narrative of the research we found, and that's that collecting or setting goals for oneself, reviewing and monitoring the goals and having someone provide oral feedback for the goals is a promising way to improve an individual's physical performances. And so here we have some references of the different studies that we did for research. And here's the reference for the original article that we replicated.